Thank you. So I'm going to talk about nutritional qualities of grass-fed livestock, and my talk is going to focus on beef, and that's because that's where the volume of data for me exists, is on the beef cattle work that we've done. However, you could substitute lamb in there. You could also put in some of the pastured poultry products. I'll talk about some of them also individually, talk about how these differences would come about. But I like to talk from a large volume of data so we can talk about what really is changing, what's different, and what's similar. So that's how I'm going to approach the talk today. Whoop. So I'm going to talk about some of the things at the beginning here, if we were finishing on a grass-based system or a grain-based system, things that would be more similar between the two groups. And that would be in terms of proximate composition, crude protein content, cholesterol content, tenderness, and then some of our sensory panel work. So if we look at proximate composition of the longissimus muscle, when we talk about proximate composition on the science side, this would be of the total nutrients. So we have moisture, we have protein, we have lipid, and we have ash, okay? Now there's one missing there. Anybody know what it is? It's not on the list. If you had a different food group, carbohydrates, all right? So if you had another food item that contained carbohydrates, then carbohydrate would be on the list as well. Meats are very low, almost zero in carbohydrates. There would only be just a small amount residual glycogen left or a little bit of free glucose. So we don't even count it or measure it at such a small amount. So it's your high protein, low carb food. It's designed that way from the beginning, all right? If we look at crude protein content, what you would see is that the values are similar. Basically about 21.7 or 21.9% of that steak is protein. It has a very high balance of essential amino acids, so it's considered to be a very high quality protein in beef. With that then, if we look at moisture or lipid content, you would see in grain finished beef, we would be around 4% lipid in that steak versus about 2.3% in grass-fed beef. Whenever we have a leaner item, what you would notice is the percentage of moisture in that meat product would be higher. It's kind of an inverse relationship. As it's leaner, it has more water. If it has more fat, it'll have a lower water content. So it's on a percentage basis of the total, so those things change around.
So when you're comparing grain-fed and grass-fed here, or they kind of raised in similar conditions? Like, are they moving the same amount, or is there a factor, like how much?
The question is about between the groups, are they raised similar? These were cattle that were taken, they were from Virginia Tech University, and they had been raised similarly in the beginning, okay, and then divided into a feedlot group or a pasture group. Those then were grazed on pasture, or they went into a feedlot situation. And so they were within trial comparisons from this. So it's the same genetics, roughly, same type of cattle, that then were just subdivided. Some were finished on grass and some were finished on grain. And this was over a 10-year time period that we've collected almost 500 steaks to evaluate these differences. So this is on a fairly large data set, and those were roughly the same animals that started either down the path of grass finishing or on grain finishing. Then ash content, which would be your minerals, is about 1% typically. In terms of cholesterol, this is probably one of the things that confuses a lot of people, and thinking that because we have a leaner product with grass-finished beef, that we should have maybe a lower cholesterol level. We don't. Usually grain-fed and grass-fed beef has the same content of cholesterol. And that's because cholesterol is present in every cell membrane in the body, okay? So it's in muscle cells, it's in fat cells, it's in all of these. And the difference in the percentage of total lipid is small enough that it doesn't make a dramatic impact on cholesterol. So we don't see any difference in cholesterol. And if you compare that to chicken, the pink bar is chicken breast with the skin off, and the white bar is the chicken leg. You can see that even though chicken can sometimes be lean, right? Chicken breast, it has a higher cholesterol content than does beef, okay? So you can't really rely on leanness to tell you about cholesterol content in the meat product. And we don't see any major differences between finishing on grass or on grain on cholesterol content. What about tenderness and palatability? Of the 500 steaks we've measured, here is the shear force value for grass-fed versus grain-fed, and this is after 14 days of post-mortem aging. Okay, that would be kind of the traditional amount of time we would spend aging that product post-mortem. And you can see they're both slightly above 2.5, and that's kilograms of shear force. WBS stands for Warner-Bratzler shear force. And that's our objective measure of tenderness. What we do is cook a steak, we take some cores out of that steak, we have a little machine, shears the core in half to simulate what it would take if you chewed on that piece of meat, and it tells us how much force it took to shear that. So is a higher number better? No, right? A higher number would indicate toughness, and a lower number would indicate more tenderness, okay? And so what you can see is we just do not see a difference here in shear force between grass-fed and grain-finished animals when it's been aged 14 days. The other comment I would make on this in terms of grass finishing, in the 10 years of this project, what we did in terms of an endpoint, because that's always kind of, I think, one of the hardest challenges in a grass finishing system, when is that animal finished, right? Is it weight I should use? Is it fat thickness? How do I decide? Is it the amount of forage that I have? And what we decided was just to use animal age. So we grazed them on forage until the fall, and then we would harvest them at 18 months of age. No matter what they weighed, no matter how much fat thickness, when we started to run out of forage as we went into the fall, okay, we went ahead and harvested those animals. So we did a follow-up study to this then, thinking that maybe because of the way we manage the cattle and determine the finishing time period for those animals, that we used animal age, maybe this is an important point in terms of palatability. So we ran a subsequent study where we looked at then slaughtering steers at 16 months of age, 18 months of age, and 20 months of age, okay? So basically, we took these off a little early, right? These were kind of like our normal steer time period. And then these we left on a little longer and see what happened. And if you don't know, this would be a typical post-mortem aging curve. Anybody seen one like that before? What happens with tenderness in beef, okay? And what you notice is, this is 1 day post-mortem, so after that carcass has gone through rigor, okay, and we run shear force at day 1 with really out any post-mortem aging, it's tougher, right? It starts tough, starts high here for shear force at the beginning. It contains natural enzymes, calpains, which start to degrade some of the protein structure, and it makes it kind of fall apart. Not so much so that you notice it when you eat it, but it takes some of the little proteins out of there, and that sarcomere is not such in a rigid structure anymore, and it becomes more tender, okay? So it's really important, this point of post-mortem aging, because you can imagine if you took your meat here and sold it to your consumer, would they be as happy as if you gave it a little bit more time before you sold it to your consumer, okay? So post-mortem aging is really important. If you look at this, you can see the greatest differences here in this first 7 days, isn't it? We go from roughly 4.5 down to about 2.5 kilos of shear force. And that's a 2 kilo difference, and I can guarantee you every consumer is going to notice that kind of a difference. We usually use a rule of thumb of about 0.5 kilo difference in shear force. A consumer will start to be able to notice that difference. So as you get above that difference, the consumer will notice that in palatability. If it's less than that, it may be close enough that a consumer can't quite tell that it's tough or tender compared to the other one. But as it starts to approach above 0.5 kilo difference, then you would start to say, consumers can tell this. If I gave them steak A and steak B, they would be able to tell the difference. And so when you look at our differences in ages here, the blue line is for the 16-month-old steer, the red line is the 18-month, and the black line is for the 20-month. What's the difference here at the beginning? About 4/10 of a kilo, roughly. Every time we went a little bit older with that animal, initial tenderness went up, okay? So you can see we started about 4 kilos. We're about 4.4 as we went to 18 months, and we're close to about 4.6 as we went, 4.8 somewhere in here as we went up to 20 months of age. So you can see that initial shear force is increasing.
Why the difference in the, correlation of the 18-month-old, why it drops so much faster?
In terms of the aging profile, is that what you're asking? Yes, okay. No, they all have these enzymes present. So, you know, it's a little bit steeper rate than the others, as you allude to. And it may just be some effect of the amount of calcium that's in there, because they are calcium-dependent proteases. So the amount of calcium would play a role in this, as well as the amount of that enzyme that's present. But you can see if we look then at day 7 of postmortem aging, those steers that were harvested at 16 and 18 months of age then are more tender than those at 20. As we go out to 14 days of aging, it's true, and you had to take the 20-month-old steers all the way out to 28 days of aging to get the similar tenderness of the younger steers that were aged a shorter period of time, okay? So we do think that probably one of the critical things to think about in terms of tenderness is the age of that animal at slaughter. Some people worry about weight and they try to get as many pounds on as they can, but sometimes maybe that's during a period of time when we don't have as much forage. We're holding them around, trying to get them bigger, but they're not really gaining as good as we would like. And what we've kind of done then as with the rest of that group is to try to manage them, that we graze that high quality forage, and once we start to get low and things slow down, we would send those steers to town versus hanging on to them for 4 or 5 more months trying to get some more weight on them, okay? So animal age can impact tenderness. Now if we look at consumer panels, and this is one we did at a South Carolina Cattlemen's Association meeting. We had finished cattle off different forages. So this is alfalfa, Bermuda grass, chicory, cowpea, and pearl millet. And the yellow bar is a score. We told them to rate it for tenderness, and they did, okay? The purple bar is, we said, which one is your favorite? We made them select one. Which one did you like best, okay? And in trained sensory panels, we can't ever do this. They don't allow that. You know, we can't ask them to choose. We want them to rate it all. But in a consumer panel, this is typically something we would do. We say, which one you like best? And you can see that there was a high preference for the alfalfa finished beef. Many people thought that that was a very desirable product and were very happy with the consumption of that product during this test. Then cowpea and pearl millet were some of the next at 20% like those of each. And then the Bermuda grass and the chicory were lower. And chicory was used a lot in New Zealand. And a lot of our consumers, as we kind of follow up with them and we ask them, why did you pick this one or that one? They thought it had kind of a metallic taste to them, the beef that was finished off chicory.
Do you know about how long a period of time they were on those forages?
They would have been on from the point in time after they were stockered until like February, and then as soon as we had forage available, they would have been on from like February to October. Okay, so we talked about some of the things that were similar. Now I want to get into what's different, really different in the composition between finishing on grass versus grain. So I'm going to talk about antioxidants, B vitamins, carcass composition, and specifically fatty acid content and composition. So if we look at vitamin content, and this would be in the longissimus muscle, does everybody know which one that is? That's our fancy scientific name for the rib and the loin, okay? So it's the major muscle that runs down your back from the point of the shoulder to your hip. And it is the largest muscle in the body, actually represents 10% of carcass weight. In terms of us as meat scientists working in the laboratory, it is predominantly the muscle that we use to rate tenderness, to rate palatability, and fatty acid composition. So most data comes from the longissimus muscle, and that's what we did here. So we looked at vitamin E content, which would be alpha tocopherol, and you can see finishing on grass increased the level of alpha tocopherol compared to grains. And this is simply goes back to what the cattle are eating. Grain is low in tocopherol, grasses are very high. So if they're consuming that grass every day, they're bringing tocopherol into the system and it gets deposited into the fat tissue. Beta carotene here, and it may not look different, they're both low, but it is statistically different. Grass had more beta carotene than did grain. Now beta carotene is what gives fat that yellow color. And if you've harvested steers off grass, sometimes you will see a yellow tint to that fat color, right? Especially if you've harvested an older animal, like an older cow, lots of times they'll be very yellow. And that's just accumulation of beta carotene. It's nothing to be worried about. It actually means your beef was on grass and has a higher level of antioxidants. But sometimes in the industry, people use that as a negative and say, well, that's a yellow fat, and will discriminate against that in terms of a commodity-based system. But for you in a grass finishing system, if you're direct marketing and working with your processor, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that anything's going to be wrong with that fat. It just has more beta carotene in it, and that gives it that yellow color. Then we can look at 2 B vitamins, riboflavin and thiamine, okay? And you can see with grass finishing, we see a higher level of those B vitamins in the meat. And beef is a good source of B vitamins. Those B vitamins are produced in the rumen, so when we have a functional rumen, an animal that's out grazing, they're going to produce more B vitamins and they're going to be deposited in the muscle tissue. One of the big differences here, if we look at grass finished versus grain finished systems, and again this goes back to harvesting those steers at 18 months of age, okay? So we harvested them at a constant animal age, not necessarily a specific weight for each steer. If we do that, what happens? Well, in our system and with these cattle, when we finished them on grass, we ended up with a 554-pound carcass at 18 months of age. In a grain finished steer that we had in the feedlot, okay, we finished them with a 774-pound carcass. So there was a 200 difference in pounds of weight between the two, okay, 220 pounds. If you look at the composition, this is the amount of muscle in orange, the amount of fat in blue, and the amount of bone on that carcass in red. Between the two, which one is really changing? The blue bar, right? The portion of the pie here that's in blue. And here we have roughly 75 pounds of fat on the carcass with grass finish versus 180 pounds of fat on that carcass that was grain finished. So when we feed animals a very high concentrate diet, we stimulate lipogenesis and fat deposition. So those animals will put on much more fat than will a steer that's been grazing because of the difference in the energy content of that diet. And this is one of the major differences then between finishing on grass versus grain. And of this 220-pound difference, half of that was excess fat that we didn't put on the animal. So yes, I finished a steer that was lighter in weight, had a smaller carcass off grass, but half of that difference was not excess fat that I put on the animal, that I wasted money on, putting it on him in the feedlot. It goes into the packer, and what happens to it at the packer stage before it goes to the retailer? Somebody takes a knife and trims off all that excess fat because the consumer doesn't want to see it. Most every steak in the supermarket is zero trim, okay? That animal didn't show up at the packing plant that way. He had probably a ½ inch, maybe 6/10 of an inch of back fat on him when he came to the packing plant. The packer had to trim that all off, so it takes time to trim that off. Takes dollars to trim that off. Also extreme loss of value. I paid whatever carcass price was. When I get done with tallow, I get maybe 5 cents a pound. And I think as we think about sustainability in our beef systems, can we really say that this is a sustainable long-term operation? If we're putting fat on an animal, we're trimming it off and basically throwing it away. We've lost dollars there, and you wonder how long we can keep those kinds of things up. You had a question.
Well, I calculated it, it's about 12% of it was in bones, too. My question was going to be what percentage is of that difference is in bones?
Yeah, there's some in bone.
12%.
There's a difference here, and a little bit of difference in muscle as well.
But 60% of it is bones and fat.
Mm-hmm.
Basically.
Yes.
So I was trying to-
Yeah. So the big difference is in fat deposition on these animals. So fat is the major difference, and we're going to talk about that then individually here now in the next portion of it. So if we look at then back again within this steak, the longissimus muscle, the amount of total fat in the steak, and I'm going to present this on a percentage basis as well as a gram per steak basis, okay? So you know of the percentage of fat versus if I ate a whole steak, how much would I consume? So if we look at grass finishing, we're somewhere around 2.45% total fat in the muscle versus 5.39. And why is that different? Because when we feed a high energy diet, we will deposit more intramuscular fat or marbling, okay? And so if we think about that in terms of these steers, usually the steers we finished on grass would be about 80-90% select. We got very few that would grade choice straight off grass. The cattle we put in the feedlot were 80-90% choice, okay? So if you have more intramuscular fat and higher marbling scores, that means you have more fat deposited in the muscle as well, not just on the carcass, but also in the fat. So this is the difference in terms of the amount of intramuscular fat that's been deposited in that steak. So we're at 2.5 versus 5.4. If we calculate that out for the size of the steak, and actually this is from our data when we do shear force, we measure the weight of the steak raw and after cooking. And so I just sum that all up. Roughly when we get done with shear force, we're somewhere around a 5.5 ounce cooked steak. Okay? That's roughly the size of that longissimus muscle after cooking. Now, the American Heart Association says a serving size is 3 ounces. So sometimes I calculate this on a per serving basis, and I know it's crazy because nobody eats 3 ounces. Then I sampled, well, let's act like I went to the restaurant and I had a Big Mac for lunch and I had, some massive steak for supper, and I could calculate it that way. And then I thought, well, most of us aren't eating it that way either. We're eating it at home at the table, right? So that's how I calculated this up, just based upon the weight of the steaks that we cooked, and that's roughly where we are, about 5.5 ounces if you were eating that yourself at home. And so in terms of that then, if we ate that whole steak, we'd get about 3.8 grams of total fat from the grass-fed side, and we get 8.5 grams of fat from the grain-finished steer, okay? So roughly we're losing about half the fat in that muscle, whether you look at it on a percentage basis or on a total fat gram per steak. This becomes important because a lot of people, right or wrong, we've heard a lot of different talks about the amount of fat in the diet. People are concerned about fat, right? So that's usually one of the questions I would get about grain-fed beef. Well, there's so much fat in it. It doesn't compare to poultry. What can I do? And to me, that's one of the nice things about grass-finished beef is here we have another product that's leaner, has some beneficial fatty acids, tastes just as good, and is as palatable. So they have another option in the marketplace for a lean cut. And I think that's one of the big benefits to me for finishing on grass. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about fatty acids, and I know sometimes this gets a little complicated. And basically we can have different categories. We can have saturated, monounsaturated, which contain one double bond, or polyunsaturated, which would have 2 or more. In terms of a specific structure of a fatty acid, this top one is stearic acid. It's an 18 carbon fatty acid, saturated fatty acid. The one below it is oleic acid. It's an 18 carbon fatty acid, but it has one double bond here in the center at a cis-9 or an N9 position. And you can see that it kind of changes the shape of that fatty acid, doesn't it, when we put that double bond in, okay? And so we can have what's called a cis configuration or a trans configuration of these double bonds. We actually have both present in grass-finished beef. We have some monounsaturated cis bonds like oleic acid that I just showed you. We also have some trans octadecanoic acids, and one you probably have heard of is trans 11 vicinic acid. So we have some with a cis bond, we have some with the trans bond. The trans bond is typically very unusual. We get it because we're working with ruminant animals, all right? The rumen microbes can rearrange those double bonds and make a trans bond. The human body cannot, okay? The only other way to get trans bond is to take some vegetable oil, react it with a base, and you get a man-made, manufactured, partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. And that's where you get tons of trans fat. And we've already heard about all the bad things about trans fat. But what we try to talk about is the difference between those produced naturally by a ruminant animal versus those that are man-made, synthetic, in the margarine or partially hydrogenated vegetable oil companies. When we look at the major fatty acids in beef, okay, so this is the ranking of grain-fed from the top to the bottom, the top 6, I should say, and here's grass-fed, the top 7. And what you see is a lot of these are the same fatty acid, right? But they're there in different percentages. So the composition is different, but the top 3 are the same, oleic, palmitic, and stearic, okay? If you notice on this top one, that's a monounsaturated fatty acid. So if you learn nothing else today, you can repeat after me, not all fat in beef is saturated. Okay, can you say that? Not all fat in beef is saturated. For whatever reason in the media, anytime there's a statement about saturated fat, I always hear, like in red meat. You know, that's what they always say. Well, reduce saturated fat, like in red meats. Well, we're not all saturated. Get your facts straight, right? Okay? So about 40%, 30 to 40% is oleic acid, and that's a monounsaturated fatty acid. Okay? So that's like canola oil and olive oil, where we hear good things about monounsaturated fatty acids. So it's important to remember that all beef is not saturated. Then as we come in the bottom, you'll see that we have palmitoleic, linolenic, and myristic, and then trans 11 vicinic shows up over on this side in the grass-fed side. And I'm going to talk about these individually, but overall we have a lot of the same fatty acids, maybe in the same ranking or relative proportion as to which one's the largest, etc. But there are differences in the percentage of these that accumulate in the muscle. As I talked about just briefly here, there's different ways to present fatty acid data, and I try not to make this complicated, but sometimes you have to know both things. So I show it on a percentage basis, and that's basically a concentration, okay? So if I had all the fat there, what percentage is oleic acid, okay? On the bottom is what we call a gravimetric basis, and that's the amount of each fatty acid on a steak weight basis. So as I consume a steak that's 5.5 ounces large, okay, and 50% of that is oleic acid, then I know how much oleic acid I ate per steak, all right? So you're going to see that I show both pieces of information for you on a graph. Not to overload you with information, but I will show you what changes here. So here's saturated fatty acid content. So if we look between grass finishing and grain finishing, the percentage is not different. Roughly 44% of the fatty acids in grass and grain finished beef are saturated. If you come over here to the right side, you see if we put that on a gram per steak basis, what happens? If you consume that grass-fed steak, which was lower in total fat, okay, then it has less saturated fat as consumed, okay? If we look on the grain-finished steak, it had 50% more total fat, of which 44% was saturated, and that would give us 3 grams of saturated fat per serving. So this difference is basically due to the total amount of lipid or fat that's in that steak, okay? So the concentration was not different, but since that grass-finished steak was leaner, it provides less grams of saturated fat per serving or per steak. All right, does that make sense to everybody? That's how that figures in. So it's really a big difference in the amount of total fat that's been deposited in that muscle. What about monounsaturated fatty acids? Well, in terms of grass finishing, we will see a lower percentage of monounsaturated fatty acids than with grain finishing. And the main reason for this is that there's one enzyme that controls putting in that double bond in the cis-9 position, and it's called a delta-9 desaturase. This enzyme is highly responsive to corn grain and carbohydrates, okay? We've done some work. If you start feeding grain, you will upregulate this enzyme over 86-fold, so it turns it on. And when that enzyme's turned on, it starts putting double bonds in the cis-9 position. So we really see that stimulated with corn grain. Now it also is present in humans, and what they've shown in humans on a high carbohydrate diet, the same thing happens, okay? That enzyme really gets turned on and more monounsaturated fatty acids are then produced. And then when we compare it on a steak basis, you see then that monosaturated fatty acids, 1.2 grams per serving per steak, a grass finished versus 3 on a basis for a grain finished. And again, this goes back to the amount of fat that was in the steak as well as a reduction in the monounsaturated fatty acid content. Now, ruminants are definitely a different animal, and ruminant animal products will contain different fatty acids than do monogastric animal products. So ruminants can have on-chain fatty acids, they can have branch-chain fatty acids, and when they consume, these animals consume unsaturated fatty acids, they are biohydrogenated in the rumen. The rumen microbes think of polyunsaturated fatty acids as their enemy. They're toxic to those microbes and they don't like it. So the first thing they do is start sticking hydrogens on them everywhere and saturating them. Now that process is not 100% complete, but usually about 85 to 90% of polyunsaturated fatty acids will be biohydrogenated in the rumen. That means there's a small amount that escapes, right? But most of those are getting biohydrogenated. In this process of biohydrogenation, they rearrange the double bonds, so it goes from a cis to a trans bond, and then they saturate or hydrogenate the cis and the trans bonds. So what we end up with, if they're consuming linoleic acid, that's this one here, a cis-9, cis-12 polyunsaturated fatty acid, they can rearrange this double bond at the 12th position to make a cis-9 trans-11, or they can rearrange the cis bond in the 9th position, making a trans-10 cis-12. Those of you familiar with CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, these are your two predominant isomers. The cis-9 trans-11 isomer is thought to be the one that's anti-carcinogenic, and the trans-10 cis-12 has an impact on body mass, body fat mass, okay? So they get produced because of the ruminant and those rumen microbes rearranging those double bonds. If we look at the composition of them in beef, CLA is over here, and this is the cis-9 trans-11 isomer. It would have 0.61% CLA and 0.31% CLA in grain finish. So it's about double what it is in grain. Now, the other big difference here is this trans-11 vicinic acid, and you can see it's actually present in a much larger amount, right, than is CLA. And this is an intermediate in this process, so it moves that one bond to a trans, and then the cis gets hydrogenated, and then we're left with this trans fatty acid. Sometimes that doesn't go all the way to getting hydrogenated itself and make it to stearic. It passes out to the tissues, and that's what happens here in a grass finishing situation. We see more trans-11 vicinic acid, way more than we do in grain. Now, the important part about trans-11 vicinic acid is that humans contain the enzyme, as we just talked about, the delta-9 desaturase, that can put a cis bond in the 9th position. So if they already have a compound, a fatty acid that comes in with a trans-11 bond, they can put in a cis-9 bond, and now you got cis-9 trans-11 CLA. So you can convert that trans-11 vicinic into CLA. It's estimated somewhere around 19% of that trans-11 vicinic can be converted to CLA in humans. So I use that to estimate how much we would get from grass finishing versus grain finishing, and then how much we would have in CLA between grass finished and grain finished, okay? Now if you look at these two numbers, that's probably where you start to get confused. Well, I thought she said CLA was twice as high in concentration as grain finished, right? And that's true, but we also have differences in total fat content. So it's got half as much total lipid too as well. So if you multiply the concentration times the total amount of lipid, you end up at 21 milligrams per steak. And the same thing happens when you do that with grain. Because it has more marbling, even though CLA is present at a lower percentage, you come back with about the same number per serving on CLA. But because some of this can come from trans-11 vicinic, and it's much higher in the grass finished steak, roughly the difference then, if you add those together, we have about 42 milligrams per steak versus 25 when you add those together, okay? So there's still a difference because some of that can be converted from trans-11 vicinic. It's never an easy story with a ruminant animal. Now let's talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids. Here's linoleic acid, and here's linolenic acid. This one is an omega-6 fatty acid. This one's an omega-3 fatty acid. Does anybody know why? Why is one a 6, one a 3, or what makes a fatty acid an omega-3 or omega-6? We talk about it all the time, don't we? But maybe sometimes it's hard to know what really the difference is. And what it is the position from the methyl end of where that first double bond occurs. So you can see in linolenic, the first double bond occurs here at carbon 3. That makes it an omega-3 fatty acid. If you look at the top in linoleic, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At the 6th carbon is where the first double bond occurs, okay? That makes it an omega-6. So it's simply the location of this double bond in reference to the methyl end of the fatty acid, all right? And the important part of this is then that these are essential fatty acids because in mammals, which is humans like us, and animals, we don't have the machinery to make these fatty acids. They are required in our diet. We have to get them from the diet. We can't make them. We don't have the enzymes that put the double bonds in that low. All right? So we have to have them in the diet. The other thing is that they stay in the family. It's kind of like the mob, okay? Once you have an omega-6 fatty acid, you'll always have an omega-6 fatty acid. If you have an omega-3, he stays over on the omega-3 side. They can't go back and forth. Because of those positions of the bonds, the inability of us to put a bond in that location, we can't change it. So omega-6 stays on the omega-6 side. It can be changed. Linoleic can be made to arachidonic and to other products. It can be elongated, it can be further desaturated, but it can never become an omega-3. If we start with linolenic on the omega-3 side, it can become EPA, DPA, and DHA. And you know these as we talk about them as our fish oil fatty acids, the very long chain, highly unsaturated omega-3 fatty acids, okay? So the important part about that is what you start with is it can be changed, but can only stay in that family. So it's going to be always an omega-6 or always an omega-3. The concern over this has been that we've had quite a change in our diet in relationship between the amount of linoleic acid to linolenic or omega-6 to omega-3, okay? So earlier on in the world, we used to eat a more balanced ratio of these omega-6 and omega-3, and this has continued to go up and up and up because we take in more linoleic acid than we do linolenic acid anymore. Some of that is because here in red is a change in soybean oil consumption. As some of our dietary guidelines came into place, that has changed the consumption of the vegetable oils we eat, and we started consuming soybean oil, which is very high in linoleic acid, and that started to shift the balance of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratios in our diet. And that's been a concern as to the complications that come with this. And as we think about the two different types of fatty acids, the omega-6 versus the omega-3, you can think about the omega-6 fatty acid tends to increase blood viscosity. It makes your blood thicker, okay? And so when it's trying to pump blood through those vessels, if you have a thicker fluid, what happens? Well, it takes more work. It starts to get stuck maybe on the sides and contributes to black and vasoconstriction. On the omega-3 side, as we know, if somebody takes fish oil supplements, we reduce the viscosity of the blood. So we make a thinner blood that's running through the body easier, not building up those plaques. So you can kind of think of them as having opposing effects, okay? So omega-3 does some good things for our blood, reduces the viscosity, whereas omega-6 increases that. So that's why it's important to keep track of this ratio. So if we talk about omega-6 fatty acids in beef, you would see there's no difference in the percentage of these two fatty acids, between grass-finished and grain-finished. In terms of the amount per steak, we have less omega-6 per steak in grass-finished versus grain-finished. And again, this goes back to the total amount of fat that was in that steak to begin with. It's not a difference in concentration. They both contain omega-6, but because they're leaner, it provides less or lower amounts of omega-6 fatty acids per serving of steak. Here is omega-3 fatty acids, okay? So percentage is 2.5% in grass finishing versus 0.68 in grain finishing. Why? Because that forage is extremely high in omega-3 fatty acids. So as some of those omega-3 fatty acids come into the rumen, they sneak past those rumen microbes. They don't all get biohydrogenated. They make it to the lower tract for absorption and are deposited, okay? So we see a higher level of omega-3 fatty acids in grass-finished beef. What happens then as we convert this to a milligram per steak basis, essentially you get 90 milligrams of omega-3s per steak, all right? And remember that it had a lower fat content, but because it has so much higher concentration of omega-3s, when you calculate the total amount, it still comes out with a higher level for grass-finished versus grain-finished. And if you think about 90 milligrams, well, you want to compare that to a commercial supplement. Mega Red has 90 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids per pill, okay? So instead of having to take Mega Red, you could just have a steak from grass-finished steer instead. And I always think a natural supply is always better than a supplement when it's available. Now, another controversy is if we have linolenic acid, how much of it actually gets converted down chain to our highly unsaturated omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DPA, and DHA. Okay, that's always a concern. A lot of people take flax oil supplements to increase omega-3 levels. However, it's inefficiently converted to those longer chain fatty acids. The fish oil supplements are actually better because they contain EPA and DHA. Okay? If you're taking flax to get your omega-3s, you may not be getting as much benefit because of the poorer conversion to those really long chain unsaturated fatty acids. Whereas fish oil contains predominantly those. So does beef, all right? I'll show you that in a minute. But if we look at conversion of alpha-linolenic acid to EPA and DHA, it's fairly poor, about 8% in men, 21% in women, about 4% to DHA and 9% to DHA. So if you're taking a high level linolenic acid, like with flax oil, you're not getting very much converted downstream to the really long chain fatty acids. If we look at it in beef, okay, and in our grass-fed beef, about 1% is alpha-linolenic, and 1.3% is DPA, EPA, and DHA. So not only do we have a higher level of omega-3 fatty acids, we have a higher level of the really long chain, highly unsaturated omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DPA, and DHA. So you're getting more omega-3s and more of the really important omega-3s, okay, out of a serving of grass-fed beef. So that's an important thing to remember. And again, over here, that would be about a 62% increase per serving of steak, right? If we look at the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, then we're at about 1.5 for grass-finished beef. For grain-finished beef, we're somewhere around 5 times more omega-6 to omega-3. And this is typically one of the large differences that we would see in terms of grass finishing versus grain finishing. The other thing that changes is that the length of time that we have an animal on grain can increase this ratio. Because the longer they're in the feedlot, the more linoleic acid that's coming in the diet from the corn, and they have no supply of omega-3 fatty acids, okay? So you continue to increase omega-6 the longer they're on feed without any omega-3 change, so you actually will see this ratio go up. I've seen it as high as maybe 10 to 1 in grain-finished cattle that were on feed for maybe 250 days. So this number, this side of the fence can change sometimes depending upon the length of time cattle are on feed. This side, we typically always see grass-finished cattle that haven't had any grain at a ratio of less than 2 to 1. It's one of the ways that you can kind of distinguish between, you can find the difference if you analyze the steak and you said, is it grass-finished or grain-finished? You sent it to me and you wanted to know. This would be one of the things I would look at, because clearly I can define, typically based upon the ratio of those omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, that difference. And it's simply due to the supply. Corn grain contains 57% of its fatty acids as linoleic acid and omega-6 fatty acid. Forages contain 57% of the fatty acids as linolenic acid and omega-3 fatty acid. So one's eating omega-6, one's eating omega-3. As it goes through the system, they end up accumulating more of those types of fatty acids in the system. Now, the question I always get is, what does this mean in terms of human health? And no, I am not a medical doctor. I'm an animal nutritionist, a meat scientist, and I try not to give health advice, okay? Because I don't know that we know what's best to eat. But I'm going to give you some evidence that maybe this does make a difference in terms of having that higher level of omega-3 fatty acids and lowering that ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. Now, probably everybody in this room is a good beef consumer, I bet, right? We all eat beef. We eat beef twice, 3 times, how many ever times a day? As much as we can. So people say, well, you know, it's only 90 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids. That's really not much. It's not a source of omega-3. You'll hear this argument, right? But you have to look at that in terms of consumption as well. How many times do we eat beef? Because we eat it every day, twice a day, then we're taking in a lot every day, okay? And it adds up. How many times do we eat salmon? Yeah, salmon might have 1,000 milligrams per serving, but guess what? We aren't eating it every day. We aren't eating it twice a day, right? Maybe somebody's doing good and trying to increase and eating it once a month or something. We don't eat it as often. So you have to take into account the amount, the concentration of that fatty acid in the food plus how much you eat it, all right? And what they found in Australia was they're very good beef consumers and lamb consumers, that when they measured where the omega-3 fatty acids come from in their diet, half of that came from red meat. Because they consume so much red meat, it's supplying half of the omega-3s in their diet, all right? So this is very important. It can make a difference because we consume a lot of beef. Now, what about in terms of, this would be some changes in composition. And so this one was done, and they simply changed the type of beef that some participants ate. So they consume 500 grams per week of meat, beef and lamb, okay? But one group came from grass-fed beef and lamb with an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 2:1. Some came from concentrate-fed beef and lamb that had a omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 6:1. They put them on a 4-week study and they measured changes in the blood in levels of fatty acids, okay? And so this is the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the plasma. And the black bar is just the baseline where they started prior to the start of this study, okay, where they were. And then after 4 weeks of eating the grass-fed meat products, they reduce this ratio 32%. Those that ate concentrate finished meat increase that level 56%. So maybe small changes like we're seeing in the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 can change the concentrations in your body. So don't let somebody tell you it doesn't matter, okay? That's because they're on the other side of the fence and they don't like the answer, all right? But we can make a difference in terms of that. Now, one last thing was there was also a study, a lion heart study. People that had their first heart attack, they come in and they reduce the linolenic to linolenic acid ratio in their diet to 4:1 or lower. And after 2 years on this intervention diet, there was a 76% decrease in mortality for those that had been on the intervention diet that lowered the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. That's kind of convincing to me. At least I don't want to be on the non-intervention diet. How about you? 76% decrease in mortality is pretty good, with just a subtle change in the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. So I'm not going to go through all that. I just want to end up here on a last note talking about, I think one of the important things to think about in terms of the whole beef industry is that we've been losing market share. Maybe we catch back up and we're holding steady again. But certainly poultry consumption has just escalated. If you look at the figures over time, the consumption of poultry has skyrocketed, okay? And I know some of this maybe is because it's cheaper, but I think most days it's about the same price for what you pay anymore, isn't it? It's amazing how expensive chicken has gotten to me. But people say, well, it's leaner and it's healthier, that's why I'm eating poultry instead of red meats, okay? And I think it's been hard for our traditional system to fight that because with the amount of marbling that we put in beef, that has dictated how much fat is in a steak. So we haven't really had a lean option in the marketplace. Grass-fed beef provides that to consumers. So we have less total fat and a better balance of the right fatty acids, okay? So we can provide consumers with a good product that has a better ratio of fatty acids. And I think that's important to be able to have that in the marketplace. And I'll end on this one. It's just showing you differences in the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids among different proteins. And also I have forages in there at this end. So here's the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in grasses and forages. Here it is in corn grain. All right. Here are salmon, grass-fed lamb, grass-fed beef, grain-fed lamb, grain-fed beef, ribeye steak from a store, and then we get into chicken products, some that were pasture, some that were natural, chicken breast, this is a chicken thigh, here's a pork chop on this end. So what happens as we get to this side of the fence versus this side of the fence? Well, health professionals recommend that we should be 4:1 or less. So pretty much all of our ruminant products are meeting that target, right? Some are better than others in terms of being more equal at 1.5 versus 5:1. And as we look at this side, our chicken products and pork, which eat what? Corn grain, a high supply of omega-6 fatty acids in the diet. They have a monogastric stomach, which means fats don't get manipulated in the stomach. And whatever you eat is what gets deposited then in your body. Now, which side are we on as humans? We're over here. We're a monogastric animal. So if we're eating a diet high in omega-6 fatty acids, our body is depositing omega-6 fatty acids. They can never become an omega-3 fatty acid, all right? So that's the important point to take home here, is that it does make a difference in what we're consuming in terms of trying to change this ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid.
Thank you.